propulsion theory is a mistake. This statement was made by inventor Victor Schauberger, who was believed to be associated with these esoteric societies. It addresses one of the essential points of the issue. Nowadays, we would call this the search for an alternative form of energy. Back then, however, there was much more at stake, namely the quest for another science, a radically different technology. To put it simply, we could say implosion instead of explosion. The positive elements among the esoteric scholars of the Third Reich were aware that all divine creations have always been creative, never destructive. A technology which results in explosions and is based on the principle of destruction cannot therefore really be in keeping with divine intentions. All internal combustion engines, for example whether piston engines or rocket propulsion systems, work on the principle of an explosion. In other words, with destructive capabilities. Their ultimate effect is sure to be destructive. The environmental damage meanwhile visited on the planet by the technology of explosion, including atomic energy, exhaust fumes, and so on, makes it quite clear that the call for a new technology, like the one under discussion back then, is clearly justified. Victor Schauberger's experimental flying prototypes worked on the principle of levitation. Esoteric knowledge played an ever-increasing role in the search for new sources of energy and motive power. Such research as there was particularly important in the development of electrogravitational and tachometric propulsion. This seemed to be at the very core of the alternative technology. The energy source of the future, cheap, clean, and independent of raw materials. Two special departments, U-13 and SSE-4, were set up to concentrate exclusively on the realization of this new technology.
Die Intuition Johannes Keplers führte ihn zu dem Geheimwissen der Pythagoreer.
Johannes Kepler introduced him to the secrets of Pythagoras. Victor Schauberger's vibratory theories tied in with the traditional teachings of Pythagoras and Johannes Kepler. The monochord, an acoustic measuring instrument used by Pythagoras, demonstrates to us how the universe was created using sounds, which we obtain through a division of the sides. The entire universe was created using this principle of harmonic resonance.
Nach dem Prinzip der Obertonreihe ist der ganze Kosmos aufgebaut. Ganzzahlige Verhältnisse, Proportionen bestimmen den Aufbau der Materie. Auch im Weltall und in den Atomen. Das chemische Periodensystem der Elemente, die Mendelschen Vererbungsgesetze, die Blattstellungsgesetze bei den Pflanzen, auch der Aufbau der Kristalle und so weiter. Überall, wo wir mathematische Strukturen, Proportionen haben, kommen wir auf das Grundprinzip des Monochords, die Obertonreihe. Victor Schauberger benutzte die Mathematik des Monochords, seine integrale Technik und seine Lehre von den inneren Welten, von den Schwingungen der inneren Welten zu entwickeln und auszubauen. Übrigens, seine Mathematik ist nicht euklidisch. Die Geheimlehre der Pythagoreer wurde von den Templerorden übernommen, aufbewahrt und überliefert. Und Victor Schauberger hat sich dieses Wissen zunutze gemacht, um seine integrale Technik zu entwickeln und ist so zur Implosion gekommen. Anhand des Energieplans der Natur sehen Sie hier das Alpha und Omega, den Grundton bis zu den Obertönen bis hinauf zum letzten Ton, so wie das ganze Universum aufgebaut ist. Alpha und Omega stehen symbolisch für Geist und Materie.
Therefore, what we have here is something whole. This knowledge therefore makes an all-embracing science possible.
Diese Lehre macht daher auch
is the utilization of the potential of the inner universe within the outer universe.
Inklusion ist die Nutzbarmachung des
Due to the forces of energy and
Potenzials
evolution
der
of
inneren
science,
Welten in
we've
der
been able
äußeren
to make
Welt.
great strides in the field of antimatter,
Anhand der
and with it do
Energiebahnen
away with the
und der
effects of gravity.
Implosionstechnik gelangen wir in den Bereich der Antimaterie und damit zur Aufhebung der Schwerkraft.
Im Juni 1934 wurde mein Vater von Reichskanzler Adolf Hitler
In June 1934, my father was invited by the Reichschancellor Adolf Hitler to discuss his work. Hitler wanted to know about his discoveries and talk about the various possibilities and what his great plan was. And he said, yes, I'm looking for new technology which must once again harmonize with the natural order of things, and that is my real program.
Kurz vor dem Eintreffen der beiden Reichsbeauftragten
Shortly before the meeting, Hitler, as Reichschancellor, gave the two deputies his orders. The two had come to discuss Hermann Göring's plan.
An die zwei Reichsbeauftragten von Hermann Göring Plan. Herr Victor Schauberger, Sie werden das
and he said, Herr Victor Schauberger, you will speak with the two Reichsdeputies, and tomorrow, or by the latest the day after tomorrow, a second meeting will take place. And he said to the two deputies, I find the plan fascinating. Yes, we Germans will bring about a whole new science.
Wir Deutschen werden eine biotechnische Szene bringen.
The Socialist Party came to power, the occult societies withdrew into the background. Within the SS, the Thule Society created a separate secret organization called the Black Sun. The Friel Society carried on much as before with its scientific research. According to reports, the Friel Society had by the middle of 1934 created its first experimental circular aircraft to be propelled with the anti-gravitational effect, the RFC-1. The men responsible for the design and construction were Dr. Schumann and an engineer from Bochum. Since 1929, the young Gertie Vogt had been responsible for running the Friel Society, and she made herself known to private investors who were prepared to invest in projects that carried an element of risk. In the meantime, the members had become convinced that the mediumistic messages originated not from gods from the other side, but in fact from a highly developed alien civilization within the Aldebaran solar system. The main star in the constellation of Taurus is Aldebaran. Could it be that the Sumerians, whose language remains a mystery to this day, were Aldebaranians? If they did perhaps once land in Mesopotamia, it is interesting that the inscriptions on the royal tablets tell us when the royal power came down to us from the heavens. The Friel and Thule societies were not alone in their vision of space travel in the Germany of those days. UFA, the German national film company, released a motion picture called The First Woman on the Moon. The first space rocket was then built by Werner von Braun and Hermann Oberth with UFA movie money. Many German scientists studied the possibility of traveling to the stars. Before the end of 1934, the Friel Society had built its first light aircraft, the RFC-2. Round aircraft. It was fitted with an improved real propulsion system and, for the first time, magnetic impulse steering. It measured hardly more than 16 feet from end to end, but it worked. It already possessed two typical characteristics of UFOs: the optical blurring of the contours when accelerating, and the colored lights depending on the level of power applied: red, orange, yellow, green, white, blue, or violet. Despite its advanced flying capabilities, the RFC-2 remained virtually unnoticed by the political leadership of the time. The same fate was to befall the first jet-propelled aircraft 4 years later, the HE-138, the HE-176, and the HE-280. Only the SS showed a slight interest in the work of the Friel Society. Its own Black Sun formation had meanwhile set up Research Department 4, SSE-4 for short, which was responsible for coming up with alternative sources of energy. What is certain is that their aim was to make Germany independent of foreign crude oil imports. Nevertheless, stimulated by Victor Schauberger and the success of the latest Friel success, SSE-4 now began to construct its own light aircraft. Using Captain Hans Kohler's tachyometer converter as a basis, and appropriating many Friel components, they developed their own Thule aero engine. Towards the end of 1938, they had constructed a small propeller-driven light aircraft, the RFC-4, with the express purpose of observing how disc-shaped objects behave in flight. By 1939, the SS had already built its RFC-5, the first long-distance aircraft measuring more than 65 feet, and with the mysterious name Haunebu-1. Under tight security, the Haunebu-1 made its maiden flight, in all probability, in August of 1939. Documents show that by 1941, the British had already found out about these top-secret SS experiments. In contrast to the simple Friel prototype, the Haunebu was a complicated proposition. However, because of the form of its power unit, it offered considerably more storage space. In 1939, Hitler made one of his biggest mistakes.
Und von jetzt ab wird Bombe mit Bombe vergolten.
What might have been meant to be a limited military action, the Polish campaign, led directly to the Second World War. Quite contrary to what we might imagine the situation to be in the perfectly organized National Socialist state, everyone did exactly as he pleased. The Air Force, the Army, the Navy, and the industrial concerns all followed their own inclinations. Competition for armaments contracts became intense. As a result, alternative methods of propulsion found themselves in direct competition with their more conventional counterparts. A sort of compromise was achieved with experimental flying saucers like the RFC-7.
Wir haben Transporte gemacht, auch vom Kampfgeschwader 26. Und zwar haben wir Torpedo geholt von Kiel, heute
The 26th Fighter Squadron had been ordered to fly from Kiel to Norway in order to resupply the 30 Fighter Squadron, the Bamba Command. On a return flight to Hamburg, I took a model of my aircraft design with me, and taking advantage of the opportunity, actually had it forwarded to Ernst Udet in the Reichsministry in Berlin.
Zum Reichsluftfahrtministerium nach Berlin an Udet. Udet hat dieses Modell weitergegeben an
Udet passed this model on to the research establishment in Peenemünde, where tests were later carried out. Over and over again, I later heard reports from people who were working in Prague on the construction of flying discs, and progress in this field was actually being made. I also knew that Habermohl and Schriever were in possession of my model and had begun work on its practical applications.
Mein Modell praktisch bekommen hätten zum Ausarbeiten, zum Rekonstruieren. Und diese Flugscheibe hat der Schriever auf seine Art, seine
Schriever
Gedanken
made certain
umgebaut.
alterations to my plans, whereas, as I was later to certain, Habermohl had remained true to my original design. The second prototype was a flying disc, 42 meters long, and was built by Nita Beluzzo in Breslau.
Zweites Modell wurde gebaut, eine 42 Meter große Flugscheibe wurde gebaut durch Miete und Beluzzo. Und zwar in Breslau. Und diese Flugscheibe sollte dann, wie
This
ich
flying disc,
erfahren
as I
habe,
discovered,
sollte
was
dann
flown to Spitzbergen in Norway
Spitzbergen
and should have
geflogen
returned to
werden und
Rechlin
sollte
on
auf
a
einen
directional beam with an unknown
mit einer
transmission frequency and
unbekannten,
code word.
Sendeskala, eine Nummer für den Sender, nicht, was überhaupt gar nicht benutzt wurde von anderen, sollte auf diesen Registrar
However,
die Flugscheibe
due to a bad
nach
landing in
Rechlin
Spitzbergen,
zurückfliegen.
it was damaged
Sie ist aber bei der
and was
Landung in
unable to complete the
Spitzbergen
return flight
so
home.
zerstört worden, weil die ist heftig abgestoßen und konnte dann nicht mehr zurückfliegen. Dann bin
After
ich
that,
rausgefahren
I drove
außerhalb
into the
von
hills
Prag,
just outside Prague,
in die Berge,
where the secret testing ground was supposed to have been located. I had my Leica A camera with me when suddenly I saw such a flying
plötzlich habe ich
saucer.
dann so eine Flugscheibe gesehen.
I was wounded at the
Und
time,
das war
so I know that it was
im,
November, December although the test flight was not due to take place until the following February. Someone had made an unscheduled test flight, and this is what I saw coming towards me. It had no wings, absolutely none. I took a photo and wound on the film, but it was already directly over me. Then I took a second photo, and I could see that it was a flying gyroscope, a flying saucer.